Hello everybody, I hope you're all doing well. Today I'm going to be talking about my potential idea, or kind of like a pseudo policy idea that I partly came up with. Just as a disclaimer, I did use a little bit of ChatGPT to come up with this, but not the entirety of it. Just some general ideas, but then I fed into it sort of the more nuanced things that I wanted to kind of see in this policy. I'll go into it a little bit more in a minute. And I'll also give a bit of context of why I wanted to do something like this, why I would like to see something like this implemented at some point. And it's, you know, it's like I said, it's not a real policy. It's not necessarily meant to be taken as something that is realistic necessarily. It's just an idea. It's just a potential, what could potentially be a government policy or legislation, whatever you want to call it. You know, something that could be, or at least maybe be, you know, kind of a foundation potentially of what could become something alike, something similar to this policy. So, I'll just to give you a bit of context of why why it's important for this potential, what could be a potential policy to be implemented. As somebody that grew up in the United Kingdom during the 90s and the noughties, there was a lot of problems with social deprivation, unemployment, issues with antisocial behaviour. And I think a lot of it stems down to really a small number of problems. Really, one, it's a lack of respect for the authorities, the police, the councils, the law, the legal system. Two, it's poor education standards, poor schooling, poor standards of education, just overall. I believe a welfare system that's really pretty much well past its sell-by date, I believe, at this point. And I think just a general sense of apathy in sort of deindustrialised parts of the United Kingdom, really, that have suffered because of you know, manufacturing in an industry going over to parts of Asia, probably parts of South America, Middle East, probably. And you know, just generally the more sort of developing parts of the world, rather than us relying on our own as much as we can on our own natural resources beneath our feet, really, and our own innovative ideas and our own people's, you know, a workforce of our own people. We sold we sold generations of people off to, you know, globalist ideals, really. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. But that does matter when I start going into this, and when I will get started on this in a moment. Just to give you a, it might not be the setting might not be right on the video here, but this is what I came up with. It's quite a big document, as you can see. It's actually two documents in one. These are documents on the side, but I'm not going to go through that today. I won't be going through all of the document, obviously, because it would take hours to go through, you know, bit by bit. But I'm just going to give you a general overview of what I think should be done, really. And like I said, you know, I don't know how realistic this would probably be from a financial point of view. You know, from the point of view of getting something like this passed through the Houses of Commons, I don't know, but this is just something that I think, I believe needs to be done to really change the outcomes for a lot of people that would be classed as being a part of the underclass, you know, the working poor, or the working classes in, let's face it, you know, very deprived, economically deprived, socially deprived, even culturally deprived in many ways. Parts of the United Kingdom, especially in England, especially in the northeast of the country, or the north of the country. But really, these days, I think it's, you know, I think there's a steady decline across the United Kingdom, in my opinion. certainly in working class regions, and that's why I believe this is something that needs to be implemented for those regions. And it's not just for the the indigenous white working classes. It would be it's anybody that's struggling in those kind of areas that needs support, that needs help to gain employment, that needs to through skills training, apprenticeships, education, or a mixture of all of those things. And that's why I believe this is something that could work. So again, this is not necessarily how it would all be in actuality, but it's just a general idea. Okay, so just bear that in mind as I go through some of this stuff. So the title of the document or the policy is called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland's Pathways to Prosperity Policy, a National Skills and Social Renewal Strategy, or it could be called PRISM for short, and it's like a 20-year plan basically. Because I think probably that's how long it would, it might be a little bit of a, it could happen, it could work, it could roll out across the board, within a decade. But my guess is probably it would, because obviously you'd have to have all sorts of consultations and meetings, and it'd probably be a long process to try and get it going, to try and get it even proposed as a policy. Then you'd have to try and go through all of the bureaucratic processes through the Houses of Commons and House of Lords, I'm guessing as well, probably. So my guess is probably altogether it would be about a 20-year plan from the initial kind of discussions to it being kind of a national policy. So the idea is basically that it's going to be it's a welfare, it's a new welfare system, if you like. It's not going to be, it wouldn't be a system of punitive, pathetic kind of punishments like sanctions and things like this, although there would obviously be rules, but it would be more of an incentivized system that would help people to get not only into employment but to potentially stay in employment, because that's the problem in places like where I grew up in Hull, or Kingston upon Hull, as some people call it. We've had decades of economic decline, because like I said before, massive declines in manufacturing and industry, jobs being, the high street being decimated. Obviously since the pandemic, there's been all sorts of problems economically, and so more and more companies are either laying staff off or are closing altogether. So of course, alongside this, there would obviously need to be some serious push towards reindustrialisation. There would need to be a push towards job creation again. So they would have to go hand in hand, really, obviously. This is based. This is really something that I think if it could be implemented, I believe that it would not only just save the country a lot of money, and certainly a lot of taxpayers would be a lot happier about it, but I think it would incentivize people to be independent, to be self-reliant. After a certain point, it would push people to to want to work, because there's something to gain from it, not just financially, but in terms of self-respect. Building your confidence back. Because you have at the end of this program, whether it's whatever it is that you go on to, you get put onto, or you decide to get put onto based on assessments, testing. You might be like a 2-year, 3-year process, depending on whatever it is you want to do. I just think that this would be a much more effective and efficient way of dealing with unemployment or underemployment, or systemic corruption of the welfare system, over reliance upon it, over dependence on the system. So that's what this would hopefully do. So I'm not going to go through every single aspect of it. I'm just going to go through it bit by bit. So just as an introduction, really, like I said, I grew up in sort of relative, what would probably be called like a relative poverty-based kind of society, really, or certainly in where I grew up, where there was a lot of unemployment, there was a lot of people on benefits, and I'm not sitting here judging anyone benefits, because obviously I relied upon the system myself over the years from time to time, so I'm certainly not a hypocrite, and I understand the reasons why people have to do that, and why people end up staying on it, but I can also see and understand very well why people who are paying taxes are getting up at early in the morning every day, paying into that system, or everyone's technically paying into it. You can see how it can breed resentment and anger and frustration from people that are working 5 or 6 days a week, and those that aren't, and they can get help with housing and free or certainly very cheap dental care and NHS treatment, things like that. And you do have to say at some point, it's like, it has to be fair. You have to have a system that's fair for everybody. It can't just be a double standards type thing. It can't just be a system of rewarding the least amount of effort. It's like, it's got to be. It should be fair, but a fair system, really. And that's what I think this is. So like I said, having grown up in that environment, I understand it. I understand why people get trapped in it as well. But having said that, I think the system itself doesn't help people really, because I think it's too menial, it's too punishment based. It's too much. There's too much of this sense of like, this demonization of unemployment. There's this sense that, it's like, you're pushing people into low self-esteem. You're pushing people into desperation and situations where they're going to be incompetent because they're not ready for it. They're not prepared for it, and it just doesn't work. And it's costing the country, millions of pounds every year to keep the system afloat. It's not really helping people because one, there's the population's growing. We're having God knows how many influx of people from God knows where coming in every week or every week now. I think it's virtually every other day, isn't it? So that's clearly not helping matters. But that's a whole other argument in and of itself. But that's not really helping, I don't think. And you have, as I said, post-pandemic, we've seen more and more businesses reducing their staff, closing down, or moving elsewhere. Moving jobs abroad, whatever. Because it's cheaper, and there's less punishment in terms of tax and all that kind of stuff. So I get it. I understand what the situation is and why we've ended up here. And I think I just think that it's now time that something radical changes. We need a radical, we need to move towards something better. It's all good and funding the system just for the sake of it. But if it's not actually providing you any real results, you need to have radical reforms of that system, or come up with something new, something better, something more affordable, something that's gonna, yes, it's gonna cost. I accept that it would cost a hell of a lot of money to implement something like this, but in the long term, it would be better for everybody involved, really. So yeah, I just thought that was it's important to just mention that stuff. So I'm gonna get onto the policy now. So the introduction, basically, it just tells us that basically it would be roughly about a 15 to 20 year national plan or strategy, and it would be to reform or radically change the Department for Work and Pensions operations, or just sort of the welfare system in general, really. Obviously, various benefits that would go along with this stuff, like housing and certain certain types of leave and sickness benefits and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, all of those things would be part of it. It wouldn't just be just everybody just gets put on some 2-year training scheme or apprenticeship or work placement or something, because it wouldn't work. So it would like I said, there would be a number of assessments that would happen first, whereby obviously if you have a serious disability or serious mental health issue, then of course there's gonna be support and help for you to get you into some kind of employment, but something that would be appropriate and something that would actually be sustainable for those people. Because there's no point just putting people with serious mental health problems in situations that where those positions of employment aren't usually filled with those kinds of people. Just doesn't work, and I can say that from personal experience as somebody that does have issues with their mental health at times, mainly depression and anxiety. So I understand it. I've lived a bit. I do understand that you have to, you have to look at things in a nuanced way, and you have to be careful not to, have this sort of one-size-fits-all kind of approach to everything. That clearly wouldn't work. So anyway, yeah. So this is what it is. It's an intergenerational. It's supposed to help deal with intergenerational dependency on benefits, underemployment, socioeconomic stagnation, and it would probably pretty much be aimed at anyone from the ages of about 16 to probably about 55. Okay, give or take. Maybe we could say 18 to 50. 18 to 60. I don't know. It's just a general kind of an age range, but probably I can't imagine that those in their mid to late 50s are necessarily going to be wanting to retrain if they're going to be retiring. But then again, I don't know what the retirement age is going to be. By the time I get to, I think isn't the retirement age currently like 64 for men or something in the UK, unless I'm mistaken. Is it 64, 65? Maybe more than that. I'm not sure. But by the time I get to that age, if I do, it might be 70, it might be 75. I don't know, but so obviously this would have to be tweaked. But again, this is just a general overview. Okay, just please, keep that in the back of your mind as I go through this. So the whole idea of this is to help people break away from a system that clearly doesn't really provide them with any real benefits. And that pun was intended. It's to help people to have independence, to bring back accountability, to bring back responsibility, because I think these things are missing in the UK. I really believe that. But it's not. It is partly, to some extent, these people's own decisions and lifestyle choices and things. To a point, yes, that's true. I'm not going to gloss over that fact. But at the same time, we have a system that doesn't work. It doesn't reward. It doesn't incentivize effort, hard work. Or at least determination or potential. It doesn't really support you. It's either a punishment or meeting a certain number of a checklist kind of thing in receipt of a minuscule amount of money. In my system, you would be paid for training. You would be paid for apprenticeships. In a way that would be appropriate for that specific course, that specific training, whatever it was. And obviously, depending on how old somebody was and all that kind of situation, all that kind of stuff. So, the idea is to move it away from a system of reliance and dependency and sort of, a kind of very apathetic kind of way of life for a lot of people, because it's essentially a trap, really. It doesn't work. All it does is creates a cycle of dependency, of frustration, of it's a system that it doesn't motivate you, it doesn't inspire you, it doesn't want you to get on and succeed and do anything. You know, it's just about getting you off the books, basically. Now, I get that from a taxpayer's point of view, from the government's point of view, that there is probably only so much money to go around for any given part of, you know, of the way that the systems of the country run. Fine, whatever. But surely at some point you have to make a decision and say, well, is this system financially more effective than this potential one that we could implement? Yes, okay, it might cost us, you know, whatever figure, you know, millions of pounds in investment to get it going, you know, to researching it, pilot studies, etc. But in the long term, you're going to really benefit society, not just financially, but just, you know, economically. You know, it's going to incentivize people to work. It's going to incentivize people to become business owners. You know, it's more than that. It's a cultural and societal, you know, pivotal policy in some ways, movement kind of thing as well. So, you know, it's about training, it's about giving people potentially the first career, maybe the second, third career, you know, and it's about rewarding people for effort, rewarding people for saying, you know, okay, my life's a mess, but if I work hard, or at least put some effort in, and are consistent, then I will be rewarded for that, and I will be supported along that path. You know, and that's essentially why it's called, you know, pathways to prosperity, because it has to be that. It has to be a seen as a journey, because that is what it is. You can't just expect people to go from a couple of years out of employment, or even decades in some cases of out of employment, to suddenly just bang them into it wouldn't work. You know, and this is why you see this endless cycle of people and benefits for years and decades, because it's essentially a dysfunctional feedback loop. It doesn't result in anything positive. Yeah, you might have the odd exception where somebody does well, but for the most part, it's a system that's full of really rampant corruption of one kind or another, whether it's from the DWP themselves, you know, through, you know, ruthless sanctions and sort of just kind of being draconian, or it's the people that are finding loopholes and trying to rig the system kind of thing. So it's, you know, without a doubt, the welfare system of the UK is in absolute desperate need of change. You know, we can all see that. You know, everybody can see that it's not working, and that applies for the NHS, that applies for the judiciary system, that applies to the way our, you know, the so-called democracy is supposed to work. You know, there's so many things that need to happen in the UK over the next couple of decades to really make a serious, positive, long-lasting change. So it says apparently, you know, this is some of this stuff is you know, it's a combination of my own ideas, my own input, and ChatGPT, and I want to, as I said at the beginning, make that very clear, because I'm not saying that these are absolutely 100% factual, but it's probably, you know, just about, you know, certain figures will probably just about, give or take, be accurate. So again, I'm not saying that everything is necessarily 100% legitimate, but it just gives you a general idea of what the situations are, what the problems are, how we deal with it. So I'm going to start running through some of this. So apparently welfare spending is costing the UK at the time that I did this, which was back in, I think it was, this was in, I believe it was June or July this year when I started preparing for this. I was going to actually make a PowerPoint for this, but I just thought I'll just run through it quickly. Because I know I still may do that in another video, but so yeah, it's costing, apparently the UK, it's costing the taxpayer something like 220 billion as of 2023 national statistics figure. Apparently there's 5.3 million working age people that were out of work benefits in 2023, according to the Department for Work and Pensions, or DWP. And interestingly enough, it's actually white working class individuals, according to this, that are the most overrepresented in terms of longer term unemployment, and also school exclusion data, and that's according to the Social Mobility Commission's data from 2020. So the idea is to move away from a system of passive welfare dependency, or money for very little, or money for nothing really, or at least money that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help either side, you know, in any real positive, meaningful, beneficial way, advantageous way for the recipient of that money, and those that are helping to pay for it. So it's partly to do with saving money, admittedly, but it's also part of making a system that's fairer, actually, but also strict to a point, and also beneficial for communities where we need role models, when we need the younger generations to see that work, you know, training, working, educating yourself are positive things, and that you get rewarded for putting in that work, for putting in that time, that effort, for putting in some sacrifices. You know, that's what we need I believe in council, especially in council estate areas. We really need these kind of things to happen. So the policy would be universal, but primarily it would be focused on working class English people because of, like I said, the overrepresentation. Probably some focusing on probably about those aged between 16 and 50 or 55, let's say. And it would be, obviously it would have to meet certain legislation like the Equality Act 2010, or whatever whatever happens over the next few years in terms of how those kind of acts evolve. So yeah, it would have a firm but fair kind of grounding to it. By that I mean you have to contribute to get something. It prioritises skills through education or for apprenticeship training, going to college, going to university, and you would be paid for doing it. So it wouldn't just be like what's happened in the past, where you get put on some scheme or some course or something, and you basically get nothing in return for it except for what you normally get, which is not much at all. So under this system, you would receive more than you would normally do on, and I think that on the current system, and I think that's fair enough. If you're putting in the effort, getting up every morning, I think that rewards, that does reward. So if you're willing to work, get up early and put the effort in and stay consistent for, whether it's 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, that should be seen as a positive thing, and because when you reward people, that incentivizes people to continue doing it, and so they think, oh well, I like this, I like how I feel, I like the fact that I'm getting my confidence back, and that's what you've got to do. It's about confidence, building people up again, not because the current system doesn't build you up. It stops you from or at least it's supposed to. It stops you from falling below the poverty line, basically. It's supposed to be a system that protects you from, absolute poverty, But really, all it does is perpetuates a cycle of relative poverty, for the reasons I stated earlier on in the video. So how would it work? Well, it would happen. It would be a joint effort. It would be partnerships with the councils, obviously with local authorities, local businesses, colleges, universities, apprenticeship providers, and all that kind of stuff. And you would, like I said, you would have second or third chances to retrain, whether it's in a specific industry or career, or a new one, up until probably about the age of 50 or 55. Because really, if people are going to live to say, 90 or 100, let's just say, over the next couple of decades. You know, you can expect that probably that the age of retirement is likely to go up to say 70 at some point. That's my guess. I don't know that, but so you know, if let's say if that's true, you know, you might want to put this up to say 60, you know, as a cut-off point, maybe even 65. I mean, I don't know. It depends, because some people might want to work. You know, some people might want to continue to work into what would be their retirement years. So I don't know. Again, this is just a general, you know, sort of, you know, general overview of what could possibly be the, you know, considered to be part of the policy. Okay, so we're going to move on now. So we're going to look at the context of why this is important. So, as most people will probably know, you know, the welfare system came into effect in the I believe it was the 40s, latter part of the 40s, and that was born out of partly because of the issues of the war, Second World War, but also because, you know, let's face it, really up until that point there was still a lot of people living in pretty much squalor, really, you know, less than ideal conditions. Again, that's partly why, you know, there was such a movement of like you know, major surge in housing building post Second World War, with the introduction, you know, really of council estates and things, and obviously the NHS. And so, you know, the 40s really were a really significant decade for the UK, because it was really quite a major period of you know, change in terms of like supporting people on, you know, really at the lowest end of the, you know, socioeconomic level, really, which was the right thing to do. You know, nobody would deny that. At the time, it was a bold, you know, quite a seriously bold move, and given the country wasn't exactly, you know, in a great place for obvious reasons. So you know, the Beveridge report, what led to obviously what became the welfare state, and then you had the introduction of the National Insurance Act. You had obviously the NHS, and all that kind of stuff. So you know, that really the society that I grew up in, really, and my parents grew up in, you know, we have those of the, you know, political giants like Sir William Beveridge to thank for these kind of things, really. Although obviously over the decades, probably more so since the 70s, these have kind of proven to be kind of really a bit out of date, really, now, and certainly not very, what would you say, you know, just not really financially viable as models anymore. You know, I think up to a certain point it worked, but yeah, so probably since the 70s, 80s, since, you know, declining industry, declining manufacturing, declining the high street, and obviously, you know, with hyper-capitalism, globalism kicking off, you know, for the past few decades, really, it's just, these things have proven to be really, actually, kind of ironically, like I said, perpetuating cycles of poverty, you know, or unemployment, underemployment. So these were giant kind of social justice, like societal pushes, and they were very much needed. But now they've become ineffective for all sorts of reasons, and we need radical changes. You know, essentially, kind of built more or less for the same reasons that these things were put into place, or wanted to be put into place in the first place. Like it says here, though, to address the 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. You know, in other words, basically, you know, how do we make people, you know, contribute to their society, to their culture, their economy, you know, to their local community. You know, how do we bring down serious health issues, you know, or threats of disease or illnesses, How do we get people educated? How do we make sure that people don't fall into, all sorts of, whether it's malnutrition or whether it's problems of hygiene and also, people just not doing anything, basically sitting on their backsides and not doing anything for years on end. And that is a right thing to do, I believe, as a society. I think we do have a duty to at least try to deal with those things, because those are not good things for anybody, and certainly not for the people that are already struggling anyway, psychologically, with the way that they've been brought up, the way that their lives are, the things that they see around them, and the last thing they want is more and more punishment and name calling, labels, and stigmatization, demonization. That's the least that is the last thing these people want. So according to this, during the 70s up to the 90s, there was a lot more expenditure, a lot more investment in the welfare system. Suggesting obviously changing social needs, economic demographic changes, i.e. obviously the influx of immigration, and obviously that's another problem that became quite apparent in the 90s under Blair's government, when you had a lot more problems with mass migration, the beginnings of it anyway, to fill sort of pockets in the economy that didn't have enough labour, if we're able to believe the general kind of what's given as a soundbite about why immigration is such a great thing and all that. And it's like, maybe immigration is a good thing to a point, but there comes a point where you have to say, well, we need to sort our own problems out here as well. We also need to say, we want our people working. It's like, it's all good and well having other people come into the country to work. I don't have a problem with that personally, as long as you're doing things legally. I don't even mind people moving to the country. I mean, how can I talk? I live here in Thailand. I don't have a problem with that at all. But I have a problem with people breaking the law and thinking that they can just do whatever they want, trying to change the culture, the society, the rules to fit their own, ideals and naive perceptions of the world and whatever, because of where they've come from. And it's like that, but that's another thing that needs to be addressed at some point as well. I believe it will be. So again, the 70s, as you'll know, obviously there was problems with inflation. The economy was kind of pretty much in tatters. There was strikes. I think there was even blackouts as well, wasn't there, in the 70s? I think my dad told me about that at some point. And obviously unemployment was getting worse. We had all the miners' strikes and all that kind of stuff, and coal was becoming redundant. So even though really we're probably going to end up going back to coal at some point, to me it's just mind-boggling what's happened over the last few decades in our country. It really is. So basically, the welfare system essentially kind of became a mitigation kind of thing, really. It was, for the time being, let's just kind of rely on the welfare system, put whatever money we can, whatever we've got, into the welfare system and kind of just let things kind of play out. But as we've seen over the last few decades, I think, even in the 70s, you could still get jobs. I'm guessing, I wasn't there, but from what I've heard and what I've seen in videos and read about from people who lived in the 70s, you could still get jobs. You could still just literally just go out of one job and into another. It wasn't quick, but relatively a lot more quickly than you can today, because there was less bureaucracy back then. So there was a lot more spending in the welfare system back then. Obviously all the problems with Thatcher's government and everything obviously didn't help. But basically, I think she was trying to. I think she was trying too hard to please both sides of this. She was trying to, make sure that it didn't become a system of reliance and dependency by making it a bit more stricter, incentivising work through work schemes and stuff. But again, like I said at the beginning of the video, that stuff doesn't really work. It doesn't really apply so much to these days, I don't think. Maybe it had a bit more success back in the day. But anyway, we get onto basically Blair's era, and we start to see issues with labour. A lot of jobs being taken up by immigrants, especially those from Eastern Europe, but also other parts of the world as well. And there were changes to what was JSA and obviously ESA. And obviously in recent years things have changed again and become part of the universal credit system, or basically relevant payments to any given person being all bundled together to simplify the system apparently. But clearly, it's there's so many nuances to all of these things, so it would be difficult to make any kind of general sweeping statements about anything. But I think there was maybe to some extent a bit more success in the welfare system was probably a little bit more effective maybe in the 70s and 80s, but then by the time we got to the 90s and certainly under Blair's government, that's when you started to see this really quite serious push further towards the left, and it essentially became a bit of a system. There's no easy way to put it, but I think that the welfare system under Blair's government basically became a bit of it was too far too. What would you say? How do I put it? It's just far too easy for people. It was just too easy. And that's where I think a lot of the dependency really started. I believe it was under Blair's government because, I think really a lot of the rules were kind of a bit more lax back then, as compared to today, and I just don't think it was really regulated quite as much as it is now. Probably partly for that is because of the reliance on cheap migration from Eastern Europe and wherever, so to try and help those people probably as well. And also probably they didn't quite expect that there would be so many people dependent and reliant upon the system for so long. But then again, it's all good about looking back at things in hindsight. But the government didn't quite know exactly where things were going to go with the internet, and certainly didn't know that the pandemic was going to come at some point. But really, at the end of the day, it really is down to, I think, Blair's government, I would say, that failed, a generation of people in many respects, I believe, because they didn't really have any mitigation plans to deal with, the potential fallout of the high street, the aftermath of a potential pandemic-like situation, and to me, I just feel that really the welfare system has just basically been in a kind of constant state of managed decline for the best part of, probably 30 years really. And that's why this is so needed. So, I'm not going to go through every single statistic here because obviously we'll be here for 3 hours and more, and I don't want to bore you to death, but I probably already have already. But yeah, it's clear to me that the system, it's gone through different stages. Initially it was obviously had good intentions, and I think a lot of people went into the system with good intentions. But then over time, the economy changed, inflation rose, more unemployment became apparent because of deindustrialization in places like where I grew up. A lot of places across the north and northeast of the country, of England, probably in parts of Wales and Scotland and Ireland as well. And so essentially more and more people became kind of trapped really in a kind of relative poverty cycle because they felt that it would be more convenient for them to stay on benefits than it would be for them to be in work. But it's not just that. I think there is an element of a lack of motivation, of laziness that played into it as well. But I don't think that was initially what it is. I think it became people became apathetic, and the system rewarded people for being in the system, kind of thing. So it's as much to blame. People themselves are as much to blame for their problems, but also the government and their welfare state are just as much to blame as well, in my opinion. So, like I said, this would really have more of an impact in the most deprived, economically deprived, financially deprived, socially deprived, post-industrial towns and cities across the countries, because that's where you really need. That's where you have to target. There's no point targeting well-off, affluent areas in Middle England or Southern England or something. Obviously, so you target the areas that need investment. And it's not just investment in this program. It obviously have to be huge investments in job creation, in entrepreneurship, in investments for new training schemes and new courses for universities, and etc. So they would have to be incentivized to take people on board. So you would have to invest a lot of money in the education system as well. So maybe the thing also to do is to increase the leaving age of school to say maybe to 20. That might be the best thing to do. Maybe at 18 maybe schools should have some kind of a college type thing that's connected to them as well. So I think what we need to do is to have this kind of multi-partnership kind of thing. The system of all education providers, being part of it, because I think that's the only way it would probably work, really. Otherwise, you'd have to invest in new facilities and staff. You'd have to have some new facilities and obviously increases in staff, but it's better than it would be better to use what you've got, rather than having to completely build or rebuild current facilities. So again, it would be complicated. I'm not saying that any of this would be easy to do, or that it's just as simple as this or that. I'm not saying that, but I do think at some point you've got to get realistic and say this is probably how it would pan out. This is probably how it would work. So obviously you'd have to work at how you're going to deal with those on disability benefits as well. Whether that's because of some serious injury and accident, whether it's because they have some serious illness, disease, obviously terminal illness, some serious disability for whatever reason. Obviously you'd have to figure out ways that how to deal with that kind of stuff. But ultimately, the issues are at the bottom of this. It says structural challenges and criticisms. So there are certainly things that key factors in this whole thing, and these are intergenerational dependency. We can get the words out. Skills and education deficit. Obviously, there are a hell of a lot of people in places like our group that either don't have any skills at all, or have very few, and so that limits what they can, what kind of jobs they can apply for, what jobs they're likely to get. And so again, it just feeds back into this thing of apathy, of helplessness, of learned helplessness, and just endless frustration, more apathy, depression, and so it just becomes a spiral. It becomes a loop of toxicity in its various guises. Really, it just doesn't really work. So intergenerational dependency, skills and education deficit, system complexity, and we'd have to look at the effects of mental health and how that plays into this whole thing as well. Sorry, just give me one moment. Okay. Yeah, so obviously, and what I would suggest is that sanctions. I think really you'd have to have something that would be more. You need positive reinforcement, I think, to really get this thing to work. I think you need to do away with these, these things that incentivize people to do things. What do sanctions do? They cut your money. How is that supposed to help people? So I understand that there have to be certain rules, and you have to have some kind of a system of, what's the right word, deterrence of some sort. But I just don't think that sanctions is the way to go, in my opinion. So this policy would focus on the disproportionately high levels of welfare clemency. According to this, those places are in Northern England, Midlands, and parts of the Southwest. Probably in parts of London, I would imagine, as well. And obviously North East England as well. To help people to gain GCSEs, because a lot of people leave school with hardly any GCSEs or very low grades, which obviously doesn't help with employment. Because you have to look at this from their perspective as well. It's like if you're an employer or a recruitment agency for an employer, it's like you're looking for the best. You're looking for someone that you can rely on, that's going to be an asset to your company, not a problem or not a potential problem. Somebody with a bit of common sense. Somebody that's got a little bit something, a little bit of brain matter about them. And it's not that people are stupid. It's just that people, there's disparities, there's inequality in wealth in the UK. Partly and I think a lot of it's based on predominantly on class, really, and the fact that the government doesn't really want to invest in deindustrialised towns and cities. I think part of it is probably born out of a bit of a disdain and disliking for the working classes for all sorts of reasons. Probably because of the way that some people perceive, because of the problems of the welfare system in those areas. So, but this is a complicated area, except there's a lot of things, arguments and debates you could have, and that's why this would take probably about, I'd say probably 5 years to get it into a policy, because there's so many things you would have to discuss at length. But you have to start somewhere, So at some point this has to happen. But like I said, with the issues of the problems in the markets, problems in the economy, how you bring back jobs, from abroad, I don't know how you do that. How do you, realistically speaking, when it's cheaper to do things from abroad? I don't know. These are problems that governments are going to have to sort out. You're going to have to reindustrialise your country. You're going to have to bring manufacturing back, industry back somehow. You're going to have to do it. Otherwise, this doesn't work. Or you're going to have to create new jobs, new industries, new sectors for these people, because and that's when we're heading towards probably a tech and AI, system of life anyway over the next few decades. So clearly, this would have to be in line with that to a certain extent, and you would have to invest in companies right up and down the country to help them to recover, because I'm sure a lot of them are still struggling from the pandemic, and to bring on new staff, to incentivise businesses to expand their operations, to bring on new staff, or at least pay those people for being employed in sort of semi-employed in those businesses, or whatever it might be, some kind of a voluntary position of some sort, whatever it is. But you have to pay them. You have to pay them what would be considered a relative, a livable wage of some sort, because that's how you incentivise people to get people up in the morning, because they see at the end of that month, or the end of every 2 weeks, whatever it is, that it's worth it. It's worth doing this. It's worth it for me. It's worth it for my families, my kids. Because obviously, that a lot of people that are unemployed would fall into probably, they're either fresh out of school, fresh out of college, no life experience yet. Might have skills and education, but got no experience. So that's a bit of a barrier. Or you've got people that are got kids, obviously struggling financially anyway. So obviously the things that they would all have to be relative to the person's situation. So the idea is to try and make the economy fairer, to try and make it the system fairer for people to have more opportunities to get into jobs for starters, but then obviously keep them in employment. Because I think that's the problem. It's not so much about people not getting jobs, it's more about they can't sustain themselves in the job because they don't have the skills, they just don't have the right kind of coping mechanisms, coping strategies to deal with the pressures and stresses of work, really, of being involved in a position of responsibility, of accountability. That's essentially what it comes down to, because the longer you're away from that stuff, the more difficult it is for you to get back into that. It's almost alien to you, and almost, probably for some people, almost impossible to get back into at some point, because you're so fearful of being judged and criticised and labelled that it's difficult for you to get back into employment. So, you've got to deal with these people that have been economically inactive for potentially for could be 5 years up to anything up to say 20 years or more. And I think that has to be done with a degree of empathy and compassion, I think, not punishment. So the aim of my system would be to reduce relative poverty, really, to support vulnerable people, because that's what they are, really, in many respects. They're people that have found themselves in difficult circumstances and haven't made the best life choices. But maybe they felt at the time that they were doing the right thing, and have essentially found themselves stuck in loops of dysfunctionality. And often this what accompanies often these problems is alcoholism, domestic abuse, having more kids than you can really afford. And it's not, and obviously the breakdown of trust in authorities hasn't helped over the years either, where there's a real wedge between the authorities and those that live in places like where I grew up, in a council estate, where there's this kind of resentment, bitterness, distrust of especially the police, but also I think these days more so towards the councils, when you're paying more for very little in return, or for less than you used to. So yeah, I think that we have to really get serious about this and really find ways to deal with it, because apparently 5.3 million working age individuals in England alone are out of work benefits. I mean, that's a shocking number. Even if you just said 1 million, that would be still like, how are 1 million people out of work? Like, surely something has gone seriously wrong somewhere along the line. And as I've laid out, we know what those problems are. We know where this is. We know why this has happened, and I think the reason that it hasn't been truly dealt with yet is because the government knows that this is something like this potential policy would have to be implemented, and it would cost it might cost a few £1 billion to really make it a reality. And I just think that they don't feel that it's worthwhile at the moment to do it, which I think is, to me, that's, and then the politicians and government, they wonder why people become disillusioned and apathetic and give up and end up on benefits, because they just give up. They just don't think there's a way out. They just don't. They just think to themselves, "What's the point? I'm going to be punished either way. Whether I'm in work and I have to pay an excessive amount of tax, or I'm going to be punished for being out of work." So that's always how it feels in the UK for a lot of people. They just think to themselves, "You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't." And you've got to make it so that you shouldn't be better off on benefits than being in work. That is not right. That's not right. It should be that you get paid for effort of some sort or other. You don't get paid for sitting on your ass, all day long, doing nothing, doing very little. I just don't think that's a system that benefits anybody. And it certainly doesn't in the long term help those people either, because all it ends up with is those people with years of inactivity, which then employers will just laugh at them basically. It's like, you've got no chance. Why would an employ you when, why would I want you on my books? You haven't, you can see it from their perspective. It's like, we've got no experience, we've got no skills, there are very few of them. You've been unemployed for 5-10 years, so goodness knows what state of mind you're in, and what kind of person you might be at this point. I'm just saying, you can see it from their side as well. It's like, so this is why you have to have all of these components together. Gaining the skills, gaining the education, and gaining some experience as well. This has to be the way forward. It has to be. So, as it says here, approximately 70% reside in regions of high economic deprivation, including in the northwest, Yorkshire, the Humber, which is where I grew up, where I lived for over 20 years, and the Midlands. Again, deindustrialised parts of the country used to have thriving, communities, thriving economies, local economies. So it's just very sad what's happened to not just in terms of employment, but just in terms of culture and society. There's so much decline in the way that everything just is over there, and has been for quite some time now. Very, very sad. Very, when you go down any given part of my city now, it's changed. It's not the same, and I just think to myself, all of this could just have been so easily avoided if the investment would have been there, if the vision, if the belief, could have been there. If people could just put down their differences, their classism for a few minutes, and hear people out, and not be so quick to jump to conclusions and assumptions about people, we could have avoided a lot of this stuff. I believe quite easily. So this is just going through just a tiny chunk of it. I can't go through all of it in one video because my battery would probably die. But also, I don't want to keep the video too long because I know this is quite a serious topic and it's quite boring to listen to someone just go on without any visuals or anything like that. And I do apologise for that, but I might make a PowerPoint of this stuff at some point and lay it all out there. And this is just a general, basic, simple overview of the policy and how it would work. So I'm going to go for a bit more of it, and then I'll bring the video to a close. So it says here 26% of white working class claimants failed to achieve grade 4 above in English and Maths GCSEs. 40% of claimants aged 25 to 50 apparently have no formal qualification according to this document here. So it shows you that a lack of basic, relatively basic kind of qualifications, are part of the problem. So again, that comes back to what I've already said before about the education system not being really efficient, not really working very well in a lot of people's eyes, and certainly failing a lot of people. And that needs massive overhauls as well alongside this. So we're talking about a multi-factor, sector component of British society that needs radical change, and it's desperately overdue. So obviously, a lot of people claim that they're out of work because of ill health or mental health issues, and obviously some of those people will be lying. Some of those people will not be telling the whole truth. There might be some truth to it. There'll be some people that fiddle in the system, of course. But and obviously there'll be some people that will be just trying to use that as an excuse. But then there'll be those that genuinely do have serious mental health problems. And by serious mental health, I mean serious issues that have serious impacts on your well-being, the way that you think, the way that you behave, and obviously the only way that you would get those people back into employment would be really through, I think, at least a year or more, maybe up to 2 years of therapy probably. You need to let people explain why they got to where they are, to understand themselves and to understand what's gone wrong, why it's gone wrong, and how to avoid that to cut that cycle off. That's what they've got to do. You've got to let people, you've got to guide people, but you've also got to let people work it out themselves and come to the conclusions that I need to change my life. I need to do something differently, and we have to support those people to get to a point where they're like, I want to be employed. I want to have a job. I want to have a career. I want to contribute something to my life, to my society, to my kids, to my partner, to my parents. I want to do something because it's the right thing to do, and I'll be rewarded for it, and I'll feel better for it. And if people have that in their heads, they will be more inclined to do something about their lives. Because if you continue a system of sanctions and of passivity and just giving up, those things will just continue for another 20, 30 years, costing the taxpayer more and more and more money every year, and eventually leading to a point where basically the economy's bankrupt. It's just bankrupt, and then we're in all sorts of serious problems at that point. So you've got to make changes to I think there has to become a point also where you'd have to have a cut-off point, say 5 years, let's say, of this kind of a scheme where if nothing happens after that point, then you have to have some kind of a mitigation. You have to have some kind of a backup support plan for people. Whether that's like they have to go into some kind of like voluntary position or something within a company, but they're not technically employed there, or something like this, or they just get put onto something after a certain number of years that helps them to continue to have more advantages, more chances to get employment. Whether that's like more training, more skills, but there would have to become a point where you just say, we can't just keep just endlessly, because obviously a lot of this stuff would cost a lot of money. That goes without saying. So, I don't know all of the ins and outs of how this would work in reality, but it's just, obviously this would have to be looked into very thoroughly. But my guess would be that governments would have to pay companies to take people on or something like that, or you just have to have more training, or some maybe the scheme itself has some kind of employment that people could get put into, because obviously this would create jobs, this whole thing. So maybe those people could go into those kind of jobs as well, because obviously they'd have some experience of it after 4 or 5 years. So I think that there has to be set incentives to help people feel empowered, rather than feeling like they're being demoted all the time in some sense. That would be a kind of kick in the teeth, really. I don't really think that's. You don't want to be disrespecting people or putting people down, whether directly or indirectly. So you've got to be careful how you deal with that stuff. At the end of the day, we have to deal with like low educational attainment. Like I said, I've talked about limited labour market attachment, high rates of long-term dependency claimancy, break cycles of dependency through training, re-employment, apprenticeships, community colleges, probably adult classes, that kind of stuff, and obviously the use of actual, traditional colleges and universities, and probably maybe online educational providers as well. That might be a very useful thing to do. whereby they have some kind of recording situation, so you can't just like rig the thing, and you can't just get away with it. You know, as somebody that did my degree online, every test has a what do they call it? I forgot what it's called now. They have like an examiner kind of thing, and they can monitor you. They've got they can access your you've got access to your camera kind of thing. So there's monitoring, so you can't just like fiddle and cheat. So that would have to be part of it as well. So some of it goes into like the sanctions, potential use of sanctions. Although that wouldn't be something that I don't think you don't want to discourage people. I don't think that's the way to go. But of course, you would have to come up with some kind of deterrence. Probably some kind of like a strike system or something. Like maybe you get put on some like extra course or something that during the evenings or something that might not necessarily be particularly fun, but it's a bit of a deterrent, but not to the point where it actually has an impact on your life necessarily in a majorly negative way. Just something that says, look, buckle up, kind of get your ideas together. Come on, it's like you've got a chance here to do something with your life. Don't waste it. That kind of a firm but fair warning type deterrent type thing. So some of this here just talks about basically the amount of money that's being lost because of excessive welfare dependency, and how much it might end up costing the economy over time if it's not dealt with. It says here lost tax revenues from non-working claimants amount to about £25 billion every year apparently, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies from 2022 apparently. Again, I don't know how accurate all of this stuff is. This is what it came with when I inputted all the information, tweaked it again. I spent a full day with this thing. I think it was 2 days, wasn't it? Might have been 2 days. And this is a full document. As you can see, I spent a lot of time going through different. I put things in different colours, for example, for different reasons. Because I was originally going to put this all into more like a PowerPoint presentation, but I didn't really want to do that. So, but yeah, basically, the economy is suffering, and the economy will continue to suffer unless we change the NHS, change the way that the judiciary system works, and obviously prison service. You've got to somehow bring the high street back into use somehow. You've got to bring jobs back to the economy. I think you've got to also help people with online work, I think, as well. I think that the future is going to be online, or at least maybe potentially half of all work can be online, doing some kind of online based work. Then obviously that's something that has to be invested in at some point. Online jobs, online working, to get people working. Because if something might not be honestly capable of working in the traditional settings. So for those kind of types of people, they're going to have to have alternative ways of doing things. Otherwise, you're just going to keep them on the books. Again, you might as well just maintain a status quo system for a while. So yeah, it's a problem. Some of the problems of the system include excessive sanctions currently, increased mental health problems because of sanctions, because of the way that the system treats you and sees you, which does nothing for your sense of identity and confidence in the system, in yourself, in society, and it basically discourages you from wanting to do anything, because it punishes you financially, sort of mentally, really emotionally, in ways that just aren't beneficial for long-term confidence boosting and incentivizing people to want to get up and do something and finally change their lives around, which most people can do, if they have the right support, if they have the right, if they feel that their efforts are going to be seen as respectable, then they will do it. Because I've done it. Yeah, so housing, mental health problems, food insecurity, all of these problems are issues of like punitive sanctions and all that kind of stuff. I get some of this just about. And obviously the impact on it's had on the local community as well. Identity, personal agency, autonomy, social alienation, reduced civic participation, leading to basically hopelessness and disengagement with their society. So you've got to deal with somehow you'd have to find a way to deal with the fiscal costs of everything. You'd have to find a better deterrent than sanctions. You'd have to find out ways how you could actually bring this sort of investment forward, where you would get it from, where you would make cuts, where you would, you obviously you'd have stakeholders involved and everything. But at some stage, I believe over the next decade or two, something like this will probably come to fruition. I believe, because I think the welfare system as it currently is definitely going to end, and I suspect it probably will maybe not end, but it'll certainly be massively reduced under a reform government, which actually won't help reform, because all that will do is then push more people back towards the left, because the Labour will play on that, and they will say that we're going to introduce something like this, or some incentives of some sort, and people will just move back towards Labour or something on the left, or so-called left of the UK political spectrum. So the idea of this is skills development, some access to training of one kind or another, but also benefiting your own community, economically speaking, obviously having self-respect, having pride in yourself, having pride in your community and the people around you, and ultimately empowering the most disadvantaged because of socioeconomic status, class, probably intergenerational dependency on welfare, etc. So yeah, it's a big policy, this, and I'm not going to go through too much more of it, because I think I pretty much covered what I really needed to here. Give it, more or less, because I don't have to go into every nook and cranny of this policy, but basically all it's just going through the cost, the problems of inaction, of not dealing with the welfare system, of not being honest about it, of not wanting to confront the controversial parts of it, and why it's affected the places that it has, the impact on people's mental health, on people's outlooks, on people's perceptions of their communities, their societies, of how they see the system and those that support it, the issues of how other people perceive them because of being on benefits, the problems that it can cause for very young people, and why people end up having children in these kind of circumstances, why people end up with serious mental health problems or substance abuse problems, and it just all feeds into itself as one very very broken, dysfunctional, unhealthy, wildly costly system that just doesn't work anymore, and how it's ruining the economy, ruining people's lives. So I don't need to go into all of the demographic information. I've pretty much kind of laid that stuff out really. So again, the main principles are basically the idea is to really focus on people's potential, I think, because everyone does have potential, but it has to be guarded, and you have to have the right mentors around you. You have to have the right people that build you up and believe in you and push you and say, you've got this, you can do it, you can do it, and we will support you. You've got to put effort in as well. You know, it can't just be me. You know, at a certain point you're an adult and you have to take some responsibility for your own life. You know, we all do. And I sit here saying that as someone that's made a ton of terrible decisions. Believe me, and as someone that's been unemployed for quite substantial periods of time, and even over here in Thailand I have as well. So, you know, I am in a position where I think I have a, you know, fairly grounded, fair, reasonable take on this whole topic, really. So the idea is to deal with disadvantages because of socioeconomic status or because of the region you grew up in, the issues of that specific area when it comes to its economy, the issues because of class and a lack of investment, a lack of opportunities because of a lack of investment, lack of money, not having parents with money, not having as many opportunities to certain things because of the lack, because you don't have the resources, you don't have the education, you don't have the skills, you don't have the money, which obviously again it's basically just a series of feedback loops. This whole thing really reducing intergenerational poverty by dealing with intergenerational welfare dependency, you know, making sure, you know, turning potential into actual productivity and real results for people, for themselves, but also for the wider good, really. So the main principles are to reduce long-term welfare dependency, increase access and participation through vocational education, apprenticeships, skilling or reskilling programs, creating sustainable employment, career progressions, or just a career to begin with, because obviously some people will never have had, some people have never had a job at all. Some people probably have never had a career or any real sense of true responsibility and accountability and pressure and stress in life, and that's something else you have to work on. You know, you've got to prepare people for that, because that's essentially what people avoid. They avoid that stuff because they think that they get overwhelmed by the possibilities of how they would be in those situations, by being the fear of being incompetent, the fear of having imposter syndrome. Again, things that I've experienced, so slightly projection there, but I assume those things are pretty kind of common. And then, you know, everything again goes back into the circle, and nothing changes, nothing happens, because you're just caught in this cycle. You're caught in a mental, emotional cycle. You're caught in a difficult economic cycle, and it's just, none of it is helping you. None of it's benefiting you in any way. It's making your life worse. It's making your mental health worse, and probably making your general health worse as well. Because if you're inactive, you don't feel motivated, economically inactive. You don't feel motivated. You don't want to do anything. You don't want to, you know, you basically become depressed and carefree, and you just become a kind of, just a shell of who you might have been, or who you could have been. And I think that's important to be honest about. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, we're going to come towards the end of this very soon, probably within the next 30 minutes, I would imagine. So other things that the policy would work on would be progressing regional economic matters, you know, encouraging social mobility, getting people out of relative poverty, stopping, you know, generations of people relying on benefits because of the way that they grew up and what the things that learned behaviour and learned helplessness from their parents, suffering problems and everything, which doesn't help. I say that as someone that has first-hand experience, all that kind of stuff. So how would you do it? You'd have mandatory skills and training run, Individuals receiving working age benefits must enrol in accredited training or apprenticeships within 6 months of claim. The outcome would be to try and increase qualifications and employability. They'd have personalised career coaches. Obviously, which would be individualistic, approached individualistically. Would have support and would get their progress monitored, have assessments and all sorts of different support along the way. In the hope that there would be more involvement with their whatever they're doing, training, education, skills development, whatever, or a combination of all of them. So it would be a wage-linked support payment system. So payments would be about participation and progress, and there would be potential for bonuses to incentivise people to keep going, to not give up. Obviously, there will be times where people get bored, tired of it all. Maybe after the first year, you might start to get a bit kind of find it a bit tedious and repetitive, and so you've got to incentivise people to get involved, to stay involved, and to not give in. So you'd have to have new agreements with businesses, for those that do apprenticeship schemes and jobs, to help the labour market and reduce a job search friction. Obviously, there's no point having this stuff unless you're actually helping companies, businesses to create jobs, or to have some agreements with certain businesses to take people on for a period of time until they either create one or they can actually get a position of employment somewhere else. You'd have support for people over 30 to retrain, start new careers, including things like childcare, transport, positions in retail, etc. To support midlife transitions, the difficulties of having kids, especially if they're a bit older, a bit more difficult to deal with. So how would it all be done? You'd have to make changes to the Welfare Reform Act. You'd have to make, again, I don't know how accurate all of this stuff is. I don't know how. I don't know all of the specifics, but I don't know if some of this is absolutely accurate or not. I don't know, but you'd certainly need to make some very serious legal reforms to certain legal acts and legislation in order to make this a reality. Otherwise, you would never get it off the ground. So obviously, it would be part of the drive would be to save money in the long term, and to essentially have a revolution of sorts, really, in many respects. To revitalise the economy and give people a sense of pride in themselves again, and their society and their culture, which can have a lot of great impacts for the wider society, wider good, really. So, obviously you'd have to have a hell of a lot of investment in all of this stuff, but you'd also have to have the legal basis for how this could really happen. So according to this, again, this is what ChatGPT, is it ChatGPT? I think it's what it's called. Suggested. Again, some of it's the softwares, the AI's ideas or suggestions, and some of it was my own. So it's a combination of that and my own input, all of this stuff here. So again, I just want to make that very clear, that I didn't just come up with this just purely by myself. I'm not that smart. I wish I was, but I'm not. But yeah, just bear that in mind as we continue to go through this thing here for the next couple of minutes, because I don't know how accurate all of this stuff is, but I imagine it's pretty fairly accurate, give or take. So you'd have to make reforms to the Welfare Reform Act. You'd have to make probably some changes to the Human Rights Act, probably to some extent as well. Apparently you'd have to make changes to, you'd have to have changes to the Public Finance and Accountability Act. You'd have to get funding from reallocation of existing welfare budgets, employer contributions, central government funding, probably through supplementary budgets from the Treasury. You'd have to have changes to the Apprenticeship Skills Children Learning Act. According to this, again, I don't know how accurate all of these things are, but that's what it told me that you'd have to potentially do. And I told it to be specific. I told it to give, but again, I don't know how accurate all of this stuff is. But at least I'm being honest about what I did here. I'm not bullshitting you. So it says here the Pathways to Prosperity, or P2P, as a potential other name of this whole thing would be called, would be a legally sound, enforceable, compliant legislation or policy that would be implemented into existing UK law, particularly the Equality Act. Again, that would have to be reformed to a certain extent as well, and the relevant welfare legislation. And so, yeah, you'd have to have quite a lot of legal changes happen, including, changes to apprenticeship wages, training, educational, like salaries kind of thing. That would have to be somehow drawn up and all sorts that worked out, and how much an individual's circumstances play into it is complicated, but so that would all have to be researched and then obviously put into some kind of a framework of some sort. So obviously you'd have to this would have to be a policy that doesn't discriminate based on race, disability, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or other potential things that could be discriminated against, in the aim of basically, obviously this is supposed to be aimed or help people in predominantly those overrepresented demographic, which was, according to this, white working class British people. So yes, this is, we had to discriminate, but we should also be honest about where the problems mostly are, and find a way through this to deal with those problems. So you'd have to make reasonable adjustments for disabled people. We've already kind of touched on this a bit. You'd have to have non-discriminatory eligibility criteria. You would have to have, try and avoid indirect discrimination. But it says here, like I just talked about, prioritising white, native, working class communities, based on data indicating high welfare dependency and social exclusion. That would have to be, that is the justification for this entire policy, really. So we can't just pretend that that's not, that's we have to live in the real world. We have to say, this is where the problems are, and this is why we're going to target these places. So it says here, Section 158 of the Equality Act, according to this, allows positive action measures to address disadvantages experienced by specific groups. So in this case, basically, it's saying this would be justified as a policy and could potentially be actually put into law. We don't need to go for all the sanctions stuff again. It goes into a bit on data protection stuff, appeal rights based if there was a sanctions-based element to it. And it goes into employment law considerations based on the Employment Rights Act 1996, according to this document, and the National Minimum Wage Act 1998, according to this document. So you'd have to make changes to those things. I've already kind of addressed that a little bit before. You'd have to make amendments to the Welfare Reform Act 2012, according to this document, as well as the Social Security Administration Act 1992, Apprenticeship Skills Children Learning Act of 2009, the Equality Act of 2010, and the Data Protection Act of 2018, again, according to what ChatGPT said. I don't know how accurate all of that stuff is. I admit I'm not clued up on UK law, legislation, policies. I know that some of these things are real, but I'm not sure exactly on the years. But yeah, so basically you'd have to clarify sanctions and payment conditions, however that would work. remove apprenticeship age limits, expand levy powers, there have to be formal guidance and positive action, especially have to specify data sharing and privacy safeguards, all of the kind of, quite generic stuff that you would expect to find in any kind of policy of this sort anyway. So I don't really need to go into all of this kind of stuff. But it says here, the Department for Work and Pensions of 2022 stated that low-level benefits led to participants prioritising immediate survival over long-term acquisition, increasing dropout rates from trade apprenticeship. So again, it have to be a certain degree of a salary or stipend or whatever you would call it that would be seen as worthwhile, fair. Wouldn't be the kind of money that you would get while you're in a position of actual employment. But it would have to be enough. It would have to be something where it'd be like, I can live on this, based on inflation and these circumstances and all that kind of stuff. So it also says the 2021 Resolution Foundation study found that financial insecurity was a major contributor to the welfare trap. It doesn't surprise me really. And that individuals perceive working or training as financially disadvantageous compared to benefits. So again, you'd have to make this system in such a way that people will say it's better for me to go to college and to university and to get some kind of training skills, because either it might be that that's the only option to get any money, or it's a case of you either choose something or you get put on something. It's as simple as that. And that might be the best way to do it. You either follow this system, this path, or you get basically forced onto something, and you would get a lower rate of salary or something, or whatever you want to call it. So you'd have to have some, again, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be deterrence here. I'm not saying there shouldn't be rules and regulations, but how you do it is very important, because that would have an impact, a knock-on effect on what the outcomes might be for a lot of people. So according to this, something like, just a kind of rough outline really, 16 to 24-year-olds would get roughly about £850 per month, or 10,000. Is that right? Let me just make sure that that's actually correct. I admit my math skills are not the best in the world. That's assuming I can even find it. But yeah, roughly about £850 per month, or something like, perhaps something like, maybe something like £20,000 per year, maybe something like that. Just give me a second here. I do apologise about this. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, but it would be, you would have to have something along the lines of, at a minimum, it would have to be something like 15 to 20,000, £15,000 to £20,000 per year. I think that would be, probably about right, because obviously the cost of living have been going up quite dramatically, and I assume inflation is not likely to be probably radically dealt with anytime soon, so costs of living are going to keep on rising. It says here the 25 to 34 age group would probably get somewhere around about maybe something like £25,000 per year potentially, and those over 35 to 50 would probably receive something about £35,000 to £40,000 per year. Obviously, that age group is more likely to have health issues, more likely to have children by that point. So I think that's probably about right. And don't forget, given it obviously it would all be relative to whatever time that this happened, and how inflation changed over the years, and how the economy grew, cost of living, and all that kind of stuff. So, it's complicated. I understand it's not a black or white thing. It's not a simple thing. I can't just say, well, that's exactly how it would be, because I don't know. what things are going to be like 20 years down the line, let alone 5, 10 years down the line, or 30 years down the line. I don't know, do I? But this is just a general potential, kind of best guess, sort of relatively educated guess about what might work, maybe. So it goes into a bit about non-compliance with regards to. So it just kind of really mentions sanctions for this document. That's not what I would personally do, but that's just me. I don't think that would be the right way to do things, but I don't want to keep going on about the same thing again and again and again, so I'm not going to. So we're going to leave that whole thing out. So how would it work then? How would this actually work? Well, you'd have vocational education through NVQs, through City and Guild certifications. You'd have apprenticeships through apprenticeship certificates and degrees, or like diplomas. You'd have digital and STEM training through industry recognised certificates, through whether it's through like working on things like in AI or cyber security, data analysis, green tech. Apprenticeships might be for obviously your major kind of trades, new trades that probably will come in at some point. Vocational education might be again trade stuff. It might be for healthcare, social care, hospitality, etc. That kind of stuff. You might have second career training through maybe a second degree, a first degree even. Going back to college or to adult classes, adult school if you like. Whether it's online or it's at a facility somewhere, you'd have that. You'd have and all that would obviously have to be very carefully worked out because certain people of a certain age might not have the same levels of concentration that young people have. Young people certainly don't have as much time because if they've got kids, responsibilities, obviously, that all of that would have to be sussed out as well somehow. And then you would have community labour service, socially beneficial labour rules, environmental projects, community buildings, with the outcomes of having work experience and civic engagement. So, most of these things you're probably going to be looking at least maybe 2 to 3 years of a process at minimum, maybe up to say 4 or 5 years in some circumstances, depending on what it is that you're looking to gain, or whatever career you're trying to get, a job you might be trying to get at some point. Obviously, the more difficult, demanding, stressful, highly pressured it is, the longer you're probably going to be in training for whatever that might be, or at least these things would at least get you to a point where you could get on the ladder. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be trained to be a judge or a doctor or something necessarily, but it would be something that could get you in the door of a certain sector or industry or part of the economy. That's what this would be about, is to get you to have a better chance, by having certain education, certain skills, training, experience, that gets you on the ladder, that gets you to be seen as an attractive and employable and to maintain, sustain yourself in it, because you've got those assets that you need, that employers want, the economy needs, the market is crying out for, to grow the economy, to make the society better for everybody, including yourself. So how would it all work? Well, first of all, you go through all sorts of skills and aptitude assessments, basic maths, English stuff, probably some kind of IT competence-based assessments as well. You'd have all sorts of questionnaires and assessments and exams to see what you might be lacking in, what you need developing, what you're not particularly great at, and just kind of a more, overall kind of realistic, as best as you can get, overview and analysis of an individual, and then that way then you can kind of figure out and filter out certain things that might be useful, what might work, what are realistic, and what are going to bring someone some degree of satisfaction, which then in turn makes them want to push themselves towards that, because they think, I can do this, I can actually, I really could do this, I can do this, I've got I have the right kind of personality, character, skills, competencies, intelligence for this particular role. And so people would do it, people would stick at it. So funding, would come from a number of sources, including central government grants, education skills, funding agency, employer contributions through support from the government to incentivise new apprenticeships and new training opportunities and potential employment or pseudo-employment type things for people to get involved with. You'd have local authority partnerships with local councils, maybe community centres, local businesses. You might possibly also have some kind of EU funds investment of some sort, which apparently, according to this, would probably cost somewhere in the region of about roughly probably about 5,000. I don't think it would cost that much. Actually, I don't think that would necessarily. We're certainly talking probably somewhere in the region of about £5 to £10 million, probably, in terms of like just dealing with the educational side of things. Probably looking at something. Maybe it could be a lot more than that. It could be a few thousand millions. I don't know. Obviously, I don't know exactly, but it could be. It really just depends. It could maybe in a pilot scheme thing it might only cost a few £1 million, but obviously as a national policy it would probably cost you. It could cost up to £1 billion to sort this to really. I don't know. I really it could half £500 million maybe. I don't know. I really don't know. I couldn't possibly say. But obviously it would require an excessive amount of money to do it. No one's saying this would be cheap. No one's saying this would be easy to do, but it would be the moral. I believe it's a moral duty, whatever the costs are, to deal with this problem. It's an ethical duty. We have to do this, I believe. So you'd get assistance with job search, CV writing, interview coaching, networking events, job interviews. You'd get help and support to stay in employment, for more training for mental health, well-being counselling, to get grants, financial aid, legal aid, get support to go on other programs if you wanted to. And it wouldn't just be a thing of like, you've just got them in work or that sort of, okay, now forget about them. It would be an ongoing support system for however long it lasted. It might only last 20, 30 years overall. I don't know. It could last much longer than that with various changes. But I think if you gave people, firstly you've got to give people the benefit of the doubt. You've got to give them a chance. You've got to believe that they've got something to offer. That then gives people the perception that they probably do, and most people do. But some people just lack self-belief. They've got so much doubt in themselves. They don't feel that they can do it alone, so they need support, guidance, a bit of a push sometimes, a bit of tough love, a bit of motivation, and you'll find that people will at some point be independent, want to be independent, want to be self-reliant, want to be someone that wants to be respected, liked, and appreciated and valued, because most people do want those things. It would be probably possibly a lifelong kind of ongoing kind of support mechanism of some sort. I think, or at least maybe up to say 5 to 10 years after leaving the scheme, or leaving the system kind of thing. Okay, so we don't need to go into too much more of this because some of it kind of repeats itself a little bit here and there. Just talking about allocations here, general government allocations from the DWP, Department for Education, obviously His Majesty's Treasury, and it just goes into a bit more about the costs, the potential costs of apprenticeship reforms, partnership funds, local government and regional funds, private sector and charitable foundations, budget allocations, which it says it probably cost about £7,000 million apparently. According to this, so I don't know how true that is. It might be a little bit high. I'm not sure, but I don't know. I have no idea about budgets, and I have no idea what something like this could possibly cost. But I imagine it would be certainly. I mean, we could be talking about a few £billion here potentially. Again, I'm not a mathematician. I don't. I'm not an economist. I'm not. I don't know anything about these kind of things really. This was just something that I felt inspired to talk about and suggest, and that's about as far as it goes really. Because I see solutions. I see that this can be dealt with, but it has to be done in the right way. So by doing this system, according to this document, it would say that the welfare state would save apparently about £2.3 billion per year by year 3 of its implementation as a national strategy, by way of reduced unemployment benefit claims. There's been increased tax revenue from employment participants, estimated at about £1.8 billion per year by year 5, according to this. There'll be a return on investment, of course. Obviously you want to get your money back at some point, at least some of it. So it says here that probably by about over the course of about 5 years, there'll be. It says every £1 invested in skills and employment programs would yield about £1.75 in economic benefit over 5 years, according to this document. There would probably be about a 20 to 30% reduction in poverty and inequality, in terms of long-term welfare dependency among mostly white working British class participants. Would be a lower crime rate, improved health outcomes, which would, according to this, apparently would reduce costs on the NHS by about £400 million per year. And some of it just kind of goes into funding risks and mitigations, including contingency. Can't get my words out today. Contingency reserves, phase spending, enhanced incentives, stakeholder engagement, early planning, formal agreements, robust auditing, transparent reporting. This refers to economic downturn, reducing government revenue. Apparently, that's a high impact as a risk. Insufficient employee buying, that's put at medium. Delays in local government coordination, that's at medium. And fraud or misuse of funds at low status of impact, potential impact. Yeah, so we're gonna come to the end of this now, probably in the next 10 minutes, I think, because this has been rather a long video, and I know that it's a bit tedious going through something like this. But I just thought that it's something that I just felt that I had to do this. I had to say it. I had to be somebody that suggested something like this. I'm sure other people might. I'm pretty sure other people probably have had ideas like this of some sort of it. But as far as I'm aware on YouTube, I don't think anybody's suggested something like this yet. But I could be wrong. I don't know. But I think I might be the first. As a kind of layperson, really, as someone that has an interest in the future of my country, I think this is how you do it. So you'd replace JSA, you'd replace ESA, you'd have to have new kind of sort of like welfare payments, or obviously be renamed. You probably wouldn't even call it, wouldn't be classed as a welfare state anymore. It's more of a kind of empowerment, movement, isn't it? Well, it's like an economic, social, cultural, empowering movement to get the economy growing, really. So the idea would be to simplify the benefit system, provide a single, so it's a bit simplify the benefit system in some senses. You probably get a single monthly payment or a payment every 2 weeks. It pushes financial incentives to train and to work, and it would support transitions in and out of work. And obviously, if you found yourself in a position where after training you ended up in a role that wasn't suitable for you, you would have the ability then to sit down and discuss all of those things with someone in the hope that you can find something more suitable for you, because that will happen. That's life. So there would be support systems in place to help you potentially having to transition out of one position of employment into another. Okay, so there's lots of other things here. It's talking about different potential funds, limitations and failures of the system as it currently is with regards to the universal credit system, and so it's just talking about sanctions really, further poverty, and the reasons why universal credit was set up, why it was supposed to be a better system. It also says you'd have to have reforms to housing support, obviously. That pretty much goes without saying. Massive reforms to sanctions and conditionality. It talks about the model of something akin to this in Denmark and in Germany, why their system's beneficial, why save their countries a lot of money and have proven somewhat successful according to this document. And the reason I haven't gone through everything is just because I haven't had time. And so when I say I don't know how accurate everything is in this document, I genuinely mean it, because I just haven't had time to go for every tiny bit of it. But I assume that most of this is fairly accurate. I hope it is. Please tell me in the comments if I've said something that's not quite accurate or just completely wrong. I'm happy to be corrected. So, and obviously alongside of this stuff, you'd have to make changes to the NHS, as I've already kind of stated before, changes to mental health facilities and how they would help support people on these kind of programs. So it'd be multi kind of discipline, or if you like, a multi-sector, social and health-based policy really, as well as an economic one. Obviously, a lot of people would need help with addictions and substance abuses to get them first of all into the program to begin with, and then to get them into employment. So all that stuff would have to be helped with. Chronic illnesses and disabilities, serious mental health problems like depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, bipolar disorder, etc. So you have to deal with all of that stuff as well. The goals are to improve participant health, ensure housing stability, help lower bureaucratic processes to get people into these kind of things, and then to get them into employment, because there's a lot of bureaucratic nonsense going around these days, too much red tape. And yeah, it kind of just goes on a bit. I accept a bit like what I've done in this video. I kind of go on and on and on, and that's why I'm going to bring this to a close in just a moment here, because it does go on, because it covers so many different things. Some of them are a bit more interesting than others, so that's why I've left some stuff out. It goes a bit more into the NHS and how things would be reformed there, reforms to certain acts of law. Again, a bit on conditionality, salaries and incentives, like bonuses, transport, subsidies, childcare grants, accommodation support, mental health support, NHS support, that kind of stuff. And then some of this is just about this kind of sectors where these people would probably end up, depending on their assessments, skills, obviously levels of intelligence included. So you might get people involved in the renewable energy sector, health and social care, digital, cyber tech. Some people might go into construction trades, some people might go into manufacturing or infrastructure, as engineers or technicians. Some people might go into transport and logistics, whether it's drivers, managers, mechanics, etc. Education, some would go into teaching, becoming teachers or teacher assistants, whether that is primary school, secondary school, college, university, whatever it is. Might have some people going into agriculture, defence and intelligence. You might have some people going into retail and warehousing, cleaning and maintenance sector, admin, clerical work, community social work as well, media and design. Again, some of these things would really depend on a lot of things, but obviously the state of your mental health, the state of your, well, not state, I mean that's the wrong word to use, but your status really, more than anything else, based on your assessments, where the assessors believe that you might be the most competent in, get the most out of, get the most fulfillment out of, and are likely to stay in for your own good and obviously the good of the economy and taxpayers, because obviously this would have to be something that would be partly paid for by the taxpayers. But again, this would be a much better system for taxpayers to see, rather than just people just being left on unemployment benefits for years and decades. So, I think that the taxpayer would probably greatly appreciate this a lot more, especially as obviously that system would also benefit them massively as well if they ever found themselves unemployed for whatever reason or reasons. So it says here you'd have employment coaching every 2 weeks. Once every 2 weeks you'd have grants potentially for setting up businesses, because some people might want to do that. You'd have guaranteed placements, potentially a community labour and citizenship scheme. You'd have extended training access. It just kind of it goes into a bit more about that, and the costs of potential costs of those things would go into the millions, a few million, depending on the year. So yeah, it goes into that stuff. And that's pretty much it really. It talks a little bit about safeguards and fairness, and obviously avoiding things like blacklisting and discrimination, and appeals processes, the ombudsman's role in this, if there was ever some kind of sanction component to it, or some kind of deterrence of some sort, where you would also have things like assessors every week monitoring whatever the person was doing, whether it was on a course at college or university, or on an apprenticeship or training, or some facility somewhere, learning, being educated about something or other, or gaining skills, training. All of that would be assessed on maybe once or twice a week. You'd have reports done, and there would be support for you in those places itself, but also support from the systems, or whatever that system was, or whatever it was called at that time. So yeah, it's quite a broad topic. I accept, and it's quite a difficult thing to truly lay out properly, in a short video. But essentially that's basically what the policy is overall. It's about sustainable and a sustainable economy. It's about fairness to the taxpayer. It's about encouraging people to gain independence, but through support, and have economic or financial stability, employment stability over time in the long run, and it's ultimately about trying to empower people, young people, but also those in middle age, or those within reach of retirement, to bring down unemployment rates, to grow the economy, to give people back their autonomy, to give people back a sense of belief and pride in themselves and their country, to be more patriotic perhaps about their country, to want to be a part of their country, to be a part of their society, to play a part in their economy, their local economy, and more than anything else, bring down issues of substance abuse. Really, I think, getting people off drugs, getting people away from alcohol, getting people away from gambling, which is another big problem in places. Bringing down domestic abuse rates, antisocial behaviour, or yobbish, kind of like what sometimes called chav behaviour, and just a lifestyle of unhealthy, dysfunctional, pretty toxic in many respects, ways of living that are not beneficial to the people experiencing them in any way, shape or form, and certainly not any benefit to the wider country, especially those that, like I said, and I'll keep bringing it up, but those that are paying through the roof, going to work every day and getting taxed to hell and back. It's only fair on those people that they see that, and just as those people are employed would also find out that they're getting, that something is there is worthwhile, is having your tax paid towards, and it's not just money just being thrown away for the sake of it. So yeah, just a few more minutes and I'll be just about done. So we go through the scaling strategy here. Phase 1, the pilot, would be to establish governance, deliver pilot and an annual evaluation. This is over a 5-year plan, by the way. Phase 2 would be the expansion of it, to incorporate pilot feedback, expand infrastructure and adjust policy levers. In phase 3 there'd be a national rollout. That would probably be, in about year 5, I would imagine, to year 10. That, my guess would be somewhere in between. Maybe I don't know, in a 6th or 7th year you might expect. Probably somewhere, my guess would probably be like the 7th or 8th year, it would probably become a national legal, legislative piece of, policy, whatever you want to call it, and it would become, that would be the norm. That would be the thing that's across the board, that would be seen as like, this is worth it, this is worthwhile. This is the new norm now. I hate saying new norm, but yeah, that's what it would be seen as. So yeah, year 1 would be the launch pilot in a small number of regions. Year 2 would be the monitoring and reporting of the pilot outcomes period to refine the delivery of the service. Year 3 would be to begin expansion to 15 additional regions. Year 4 would be the full operational delivery, so as a fly, in expansion regions. Year 5, national rollout, legislative consolidation. So the thing becoming an across the board reality, basically. So we don't need to go in terms of all the legislative, regulatory framework. That's not probably that particularly important, really, to mention. And that's pretty much it, really. There'd be changes to the Social Security Regulations Act of 1987, the Tribunals, Courts and Enforcement Act of 2007. Again, all of this is is according to this document, this potential policy that I got help with from ChatGPT to make. You'd have to make changes to the Equality Act, as I've mentioned a little while ago. And then there's also all sorts of appeals processes, written appeals, setting frameworks for grounds for appeals and complaints, complaints handling procedures, dispute resolution procedures, and it goes on and on and on. So that's that. I think that's pretty much the entire thing, give or take, really. You might obviously you'd obviously have you'd obviously have periods where the thing of, first of all, you'd have a massive regulatory body that's looking over this entire system, but then you'd have every few years, you might have kind of research done into the thing, see how it's improving, how it could be improved, where it's lacking in places, what might need to be cut out of it, what new things should be part of it, etc. So yeah, only a couple. I think I've just got a handful of more things to say, and that's pretty much it. So as for the programs categories, you would have the apprenticeships from years 1 to 4. So it probably would be. My guess would be about 4 or 5 years altogether, with apprenticeships. Probably depending on if you've got any experience before, obviously that would all have to be worked out through the initial assessments and whatever you get put on. Because some people might have experience to some degree. Some people might just be relatively good at certain things, have a knack for certain things, have a bit of a talent or competency or potential. So some people might already have some basic knowledge, so they wouldn't be started from a very foundation apprenticeship. For some people, might be longer. It could be it could be 6 to 8 years, depending on how long it would take for somebody to get fully qualified for something. So, but it would have to happen. It would have to happen. Because people might argue with this whole thing. People might say, well, you can go to college anyway. You can go and get an apprenticeship, or if you're a certain age, you can go to university. Well, yeah, that's all good and well, but it's like if you haven't got a job and you can't pay for it, or you can't pay for it until you reach a certain amount of money, and the university, they want to know that they're getting their money back, as does the college, if you're taking out any grants or something. So. There has to be something that says you need to make an effort in your life. But the positive thing is that you're going to be paid for it. You're going to get So it's a double thing, isn't it? It's like you're gaining something from it. It's going to help you. So yeah, apprenticeships would probably take about 1 to 4 years according to this. My guess would be something between 4 and maybe 4 to 8 years, maybe, depending on what it is exactly. I don't know, it might be that you just get into a job after the 4 years and then you continue the apprenticeships through the company or something. I don't know exactly how that would work, but again, it's just a basic, general, simple overview of the whole thing. Skills and vocational training, they would last about 3 months to a year. Further education would last about 1 to 2 years, and then higher education would last about 3 to 4 years, according to this. I think that's fairly reasonable. I think that's probably just about realistic enough. And it goes into the different sectors that I've already covered before. BTECs, potential BTECs that could be a part of the education, training, skills programs, various NVQ type, various higher education types. Where those might be done at, where the funding for those things would come from. It says here mostly that the youth 16 to 25s, according to this group of the demographic groups, would be involved in tech, care, trades and foundational courses. Whereas adults between the ages of 26 to 50 would probably be in all sorts of different things. Obviously, they have to go for skills retraining. Although actually, in some ways, they might kind of just be almost at the same stage as those in the youth demographic. So they might also end up in tech, care, and trades. It really just depends. Those with disability, and issues, various health issues, would have support apprenticeships, tailored programs. Specialist mentoring and adaptive tech. Those with mental health problems would have gradual entry programs, less strict, less rigid forms of employment probably. Probably might be part-time work, or new jobs, new things for people with specific mental health problems, and they would get health support and obviously coaching. And those with low literacy or numeracy would obviously have to go through basic programs in education, like literacy, numeracy, testing, and certificates for them to then get onto, obviously, because this would be like a hierarchical kind of structure, go from very, very basic state to more kind of, higher levels of this whole thing as you progress through it from the very moment you get on board with it to the point that you end up in employment. So yeah, it'd be a mixture of apprenticeships, skills training, further education, higher education, and because I think that that obviously people need to have the options. People need to have need to have different ways in which to get on in life, because not everything works as beneficial. It doesn't. There isn't, like I said at the beginning of the video, there isn't a one size fits all process to this thing, and that's something that has to be seen as a serious point in this whole thing. Part of the rest of the document here only goes through potential bodies that might be involved in this whole thing: Department for Work and Pensions, the Local Employment and Skills Board, the P2P Independent Oversight Commission, and obviously various political party backers, sponsors, donors potentially, various different types of stakeholders. The potential risks of this policy being implemented, funding risks, economic risks, but also those that would happen if it wasn't, all of that kind of stuff, dealing with abuse and fraud of the system, mitigation factors, all of those kind of things, and it kind of just goes into a bit more about the implementation of it all, where it might be done, why it might be done in those places, and that's just about it really. Different government departments and agencies that would be involved in this policy creation and carrying out of this policy over a period of about 15 to 20 years. Obviously council, local authorities, local industries and sectors, various training providers, educational institutions, various funding sources, data protection bodies, legislative means. I cannot get my words out today, I do apologise. And a bank, obviously, like major banks as well, various different bodies of apprenticeship institutions, educational institutions, and charities as well, charity involvement, government involvement, etc., etc., etc. And that's pretty much it, really. Just goes through some other political parties and leaders, business organisations that would probably get involved or would want to invest in it, would want to, I think it's something that the public should have a say on as well, so it might end up kind of becoming a kind of referendum-based type thing to some extent. The role of democracy in this whole process of creating this and carrying it out. Different kind of research bodies that would be involved in working out all of the nitty-gritty details and figures of it all, and different bodies that would probably have a role to play in this, to make this kind of a fair policy. Talks about funding streams here, and different countries with different kind of systems, but that are kind of having the kind of same principles. My suggested policy here, and that's it really. That is my policy idea. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland Pathways to Prosperity Policy, a National Skills and Social Renewal Strategy, or PRISM for short, 2025 to 2045. And it says here, redefining welfare through work, training and dignity for England's native working class citizens. That might sound a bit discriminatory in some sense, but it's not. It's just that as I've already said, they're overrepresented as a statistical demographic, in this whole problem, and so that's why predominantly would be the demographic that would be mostly focused on for this policy. Well, it would really apply across the board, really. So that's it, really. That's my whole policy idea. You know, pretty much summed up in a very quick, relatively quick, general overview of it. So I thank you very, very much for listening. I know it's been a very long talk. I know that there's been a lot of things to think about there, but I hope that you find it interesting, inspiring maybe in some sense, and I hope that it's something that you would like to think over as well, you know, and give me your opinions. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in another video at some point in the near future. Thank you very much.